Thank you so much, Farouk, and thank you everyone for coming today. So this talk is called The Forgotten Road, the Jewish Silk Route, and I want to stress right up front, when people ask me, what is the Jewish Silk Road? They're thinking, is it some sort of off-ramp from the main Silk Road? Is it, a tiny little, marg that comes from the main highway? No, the Jewish Silk Road is the Silk Road. It's just that we've forgotten it's always had a decidedly Jewish character. But it says something about the world we live in right now, that not only Jewishness, but the extraordinary cultural diversity and religious diversity and linguistic diversity of what was one of the most important engines of not simply trade, but also culture, art, science, spirituality. It always had this Jewish component. So that personal connection I was talking about, I want to share with you a photo of my family from 1928. Standing at the back is my great-grandfather, David Niederhofer, and my great-grandmother, who looks rather imperiously, as befits her position as the clan matron. Her name is Bertha Weingarten. They're standing above two of their children on the right. At the right is my uncle Otto Niederhofer. And beneath them, the woman wearing the glasses with the sort of very fashionable bob. That's my grandmother, Lola Niederhofer. She is looking at her older daughter, Marischka, my aunt. And behind Lola is the equivalent of her ayah, Helena. And this is another couple I've never been able to identify at the left, presumably visiting friends. But this photo was taken at the Niederhofer house in Galati, which is a town in Romania on the Danube River. Now, there are a couple of things that suddenly became fascinating for me about this photo, particularly after I'd begun work on the Jewish Silk Road. One is silk. All the men in this photo and my grandmother are wearing silk, those dapper, fashionable ties, which are signs of fashionable arrivist status. David Niederhofer is wearing a dandily designed silk tie, as is his son Otto and as the gentleman on the left. But my grandmother Lola is wearing a sort of silken, fashionable 1920s dress. But it was just as much a part of the sign that this Jewish family, which was descended from shtetl Jews just a generation or two before, had finally come into their own. As in the case of David Niederhofer, he was a lumber tycoon who would travel around various parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from Romania, Galati, the town they're in here, to Warsaw, Warsaw, to Lvov in what is now Ukraine. Now, this silk was grown in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Lombardy, which was a province of the empire, had become a major silk producing area. That was partly a response to the sudden deficit in the supply of silk from China via the Silk Road, which had pretty much dried up over the course of the 18th and the 19th centuries. So this silk doesn't come from the Silk Road, but something else does in this photo, something you can't really see because it's a name. Galati is a town in Romania, but the name originally comes from a Cuman Turkic word for fort. In Istanbul, you'll find that there is a district called Galata, which is also, by the way, where a large Jewish community had traditionally lived. But there it refers to the fort-like tower of Galata. It's a Turkic word meaning fort that comes from the Persian word kalat, which means fort. And that Persian word is related to an Arabic word, kila. Now, these names might be familiar to us in India. In the subcontinent, there are a number of places with names like Kalat. In Baluchistan, there is a district called Kalat. In Punjab, there's a place called Kalat Killa, which means basically fortress, fortress. We in Delhi live very near the Purana Killa. So it's extraordinary that these European Jews, these committed Austro-Hungarian fashionistas, are living in a town whose name had traveled via the Silk Road, via several languages, from Persian through Turkish and Arabic to Romania. It's a reminder of what these Jews here couldn't have known, that where they were living was initially not part of a bounded nation state, but was part of an entire network of trade, of cultural exchange, of migration, in which Jews were very much involved. Now, when we speak about the Silk Road, we're anachronistically using a term that was devised by the intrepid German traveler, Ferdinand van Richthofen, in the 19th century. He called the route by which commodities from Asia were transported all the way to Europe. He called it the Seidenstraße, which means the Silk Road. And for many years, people thought of the Silk Road as, a highway populated by camels. But it wasn't ever a singular road. It was rather an elaborate network, a sort of filigree of various trade routes linking China to Europe via Central Asia, India, Persia, Arabia, North Africa. And the Silk Road, or rather Silk Roads, were not just overland. They also involved maritime routes, particularly in the time of the Arab ascendancy. But even before the Arab conquest of much of Central and South Asia, ships had been plotting a course from the Middle East, down the Red Sea, over the Arabian Sea, to the subcontinent. And Jews were on them. Now, the history of the Jewish Silk Roads goes back at least 2,500 years. And my story today really starts with the Achaemenid Persian Empire. What you see on the screen in front of you is a cylinder with a mandate that proclaims the freedom of the Jews, or rather the Israelites, in Babylon. This was issued shortly after Kurush, as he was called, had invaded Babylon in 539 BCE. And this is a vital moment in Jewish history. It's still strongly remembered by Jews as part of their cultural memory, that after years of enslavement in Babylon, they enjoyed their freedom as a result of the Persian Act of Liberation. The Babylonian Empire had been the big power on the block in the Middle East for a century before the Achaemenid invasion. And in 585 BCE, the Babylonian emperor Nebuchadnezzar captured a large number of Israelites and took them as slaves to his capital in Babylon. When the Achaemenids invaded, they not only liberated the Jews, they also made Babylon one of their new capitals. And the Achaemenid Empire, which was at the time the biggest empire on the planet, extended all the way from Greece and Egypt in the west through what is now Turkey and the Middle East, through the conventional lands of Persia, into Central Asia in the northwest to what is now Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, but also through Afghanistan into the Indian subcontinent. And parts of what are now Pakistan were under Achaemenid rule. One of the first acts of the new imperial order was to build a road called the Royal Road, linking the western territories of the empire in Lydia, what is part of Turkey now, through Babylon to the other Persian capital, Susa, which, by the way, ends up becoming the origin of the name Sassoon, one of the major Indian Jewish names. We might come back to that later. Now, this road was convenient for military purposes, but also a major boon to trade. And the Royal Road would constitute a major part of what would later become the Silk Road, linking the territories of Persia to China through Central Asia. The Achaemenid emperors also appointed some of the newly liberated Israelite merchants as merchant royals and dispatched them to India to source perfumes, spices, and other commodities. And this is arguably the first time that Jews are arriving in the Indian subcontinent. Now, something else that the Achaemenids did, which would have a lasting impact, was that they declared a language the official language of the empire, and it wasn't a Persian language. The official language of the Achaemenid Empire, for purposes of administration and trade, was Aramaic. And you can see there the Aramaic script. Aramaic was a language originally spoken by a people from the Middle East known as the Arameans, who constituted a sizable proportion of the Babylonian population. And Aramaic had become the official language of Babylon at the time of the Israelite captivity. The Israelites said that in captivity, God smiled at them because Aramaic was very close to Hebrew. And so it wasn't difficult for them to learn Aramaic. Indeed, the Aramaic script, which would later become the script of all official communications throughout the Achaemenid Empire, is what we would now call the Hebrew script. The Israelites had originally written Hebrew in a very different script, one called Proto-Hebrew script, which looked very little like Aramaic. It was because of the Persian liberation that the Israelites, later the Jews, came to write in the script that we now call Hebrew. But it was the Aramaic script, and Persians regarded it as their script for the longest time. Now, interestingly, this script came to the subcontinent. And when the Emperor Ashoka inscribed his edicts on pillars in various parts of his empire, he inscribed them in a variety of languages, including Prakrit and also Greek. But in the northwestern parts of his empire, for instance, in Kandahar and what is now Afghanistan, Gandhara, Taxila, and Lagman in what is now Pakistan, the edicts were inscribed in Aramaic. You can see a version of one of the Aramaic inscriptions by Ashoka in that central image. Around this time, the script began to evolve in what was called the Cochin Empire, where Sanskrit was one of the official languages, but the Aramaic script was adapted and adjusted and it became known as something called karosti. Now, the fascinating thing about karosti, apart from its derivation from the Aramaic script, is that the word is identical to the Hebrew word for writing, karoshet, which suggests that the Kushan adaptation of the Aramaic script was something that may have been facilitated by Jewish merchants traveling from the Achaemenid territories through the Kushan territories. That word karoshet suggests already the extent to which some kind of Jewish Israelite influence, some kind of cultural exchange was taking place between a culture of the Middle East and a culture of North India. But there was another way in which Aramaic arrived in the subcontinent. I've spoken about the maritime Silk Route. So merchants sailing from Persia to the port, the Malabar port of what was called Muziris, brought with them Aramaic script. And can I just ask people to turn off their mics, please? There's a little bit of background noise. Thank you very much. We have records from more than 1,500 years ago of grants made to communities of people who had settled on the Malabar coast. These grants are inscribed variously in early Malayalam, Arabic, and Aramaic Hebrew script. Interestingly, the so-called Syrian Christians of Kerala, their liturgical language is still a version of Aramaic called Syriac. So this suggests how Aramaic had a ripple effect across the territories of Central, South Asia. And Jews were very much involved in the dissemination and spread of Aramaic. Aramaic was, of course, later to become an official Jewish language. Part of the Jewish Bible is written in Aramaic. When I went through various Jewish rituals as a much younger person, I had to commit certain Aramaic lines to memory. My ketubah, which is a wedding contract, was written up in Aramaic. So I'd grown up believing that Aramaic was an exclusively Jewish language. Jesus Christ had grown up speaking Aramaic as his native language. And of course, Jesus, before giving birth to one of the great religions of the world, Christianity, was of course a Jew, an Aramaic-speaking Jew. But the fact is, Jesus, like many other Aramaic-speaking Jews, was part of what had been a client state of a larger Persian Empire that had used Aramaic as its official language. But as I said, Jews were instrumental in the spread of Aramaic across the extent of the Achaemenid Empire and then into the Indian subcontinent. Now, things changed a little bit with the rise of the Arabs and in particular the Abbasid Caliphate. What you can see here is not a futuristic space station, even though it looks a little bit like one, but this is Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. It's a computer-generated version of Baghdad as it would have looked from the air in about 900 Common Era. And Baghdad was a major cultural center. Even though we identify it with Arabs, at this time it was a very Persianate center. The Abbasids, who were at the heart of the new Islamic empire, were wannabe Persians. Even the name Baghdad is a Persian name. It means gift of God. Now, the Abbasid Caliphate took over many of the trading routes that the former Aramaic-speaking Jewish merchants had plied their trade along. The Silk Roads, as we now know them, had really opened up in about 130 BCE with the creation of a route across the mountains dividing China from Central Asia. From that time, from Han Dynasty China, silk, but a variety of other commodities, including porcelain, sugar, spices, etc., were shipped from China and from India across the Persian territories through the Middle East to Europe. Now, chief amongst the traders were a group of people from Central Asia, initially a Zoroastrian people called the Sogdians. They were based in trading towns like Bukhara and what would later become Samarkand. The Sogdians were known in the Cochin Empire as Sartavaha. Sartavaha meant in Sanskrit a trading caravan. Sartavaha seems to have been shortened later to Sart. And the Sart Sogdian merchants became very well known for their rather unusual headgear. They look a little bit like Dumbledore from Harry Potter, but they traveled the breadth of the Silk Roads between China in the Far East and Spain in the Far West. At the same time, they developed an association with a Jewish group of traders known as the Radhanites. Now, they're a rather shadowy group now, and there was a lot of debate about who the Radhanites were. All we knew for a long time was that they were Jewish merchants, but there was some debate about where exactly they came from. European historians suggested that they were French Jewish merchants. Some said they were Jewish German merchants from the Rhine area. But it's fairly clear that they came from the vicinity of Baghdad, where there was a province called Al-Radan. And these were descendants of the old Babylonian Jews, the Israelites who had been liberated by the Persians. They had been Aramaic speakers, but they were also, at this point, Persian speakers. And the Radhanites became very politically important with the ascendancy of Islam, because they served as kind of neutral mediating figures between Christian powers in the West, Muslim powers in Central Asia, and the Chinese cultures in the East. And the Radhanites too also became associated with the Sartavaha culture of the Sogdians, so much so that the Radhanites too became identified with the name of Sart. Now we can see here something of the roots that the Radhanites as well as the Sogdians played. The Radhanites in particular had something of a monopoly on the Silk Road trade in its western portions, from Europe through to Baghdad. But they also traveled far east into China. We have Hebrew and Aramaic records from the Taklamakan Desert in China that were discovered only in the late 19th century. They've been buried there for well over 1,000 years. The Radhanites also probably traveled into India. And they not only brought with them commodities for sale, they were also vital in the dissemination of new forms of knowledge and culture. So a Spanish Jew named Ibrahim ibn Dawood, Abraham, the son of David, he was a scholar of Aristotle in the 9th century, and he claims that a Radhanite Jewish merchant named Yusuf, who was based in Sind, had brought so-called Arabic numerals with him back to Spain. There's been a lot of debate about where Arabic numerals come from. Many people don't call them Arabic numerals now, they just call them numbers. that bottom column at the left, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We think of them simply as numbers. But they're very closely linked, of course, to the numerals that were used throughout the Abbasid Caliphate and that came to be known in medieval Europe as Arabic numerals. But it's been pointed out that these Arabic numerals were also Indian numerals, which are very close to the so-called Brahmi and Devanagari numerals that were used in northern India in places like Sindh. But it's clear that there was a strong cultural and trading connection because of the Jewish trade, the Jewish Radhanite trade between parts of what are now India and Europe. Other centers of Jewish Sart culture included Bukhara. Here's a photo of a Jewish cemetery in Bukhara. Samarkand, this is the ceiling of the Jewish synagogue there, the absolutely beautiful synagogue there. And as far east as Kaifeng, which was the old imperial capital of China, there was a very lively and robust Jewish community that survived for well over 1,000 years. It's now been pretty much suppressed, but it's interesting there, the Jews intermarried with a people called the Hui, who, as far as we can tell, were the Islamicized descendants of the Zoroastrian Sogdian merchants. They were fellow Persian speakers. They regarded each other, the Radhanites and the Sogdian Hui, as kin. And so there are many people in China with the name Hui who are descended from Muslims, but also from Jews. Now, that intermarriage suggests that identities that we're accustomed, thanks to a good 80 years of brainwashing, to think of as absolutely incommensurate, i.e. Judaism and Islam, Jews and Muslims, they overlapped. I was astonished in Bukhara to see this sign. The local synagogue is known as the Synagogue Masjidi, the synagogue mosque. And indeed, Jews in Bukhara for a long time prayed in the same mosque where Islamic services were held. Jews in Bukhara would say at the end of every service, they would say, Salam Aleichem. Jews in Bukhara would have qazis. So there was an extraordinary cultural overlap between Judaism and Islam in these Sart Radhanite hubs. Here's another example. This is the Jewish cemetery in Samarkand. And if you look closely at the left, you'll see there's several inscriptions. On the right hand side, it says Jewish cemetery in English and in Hebrew. In the left, you have Ebreskoye, that's Russian for Jewish cemetery. But above it is the Uzbek phrase for Jewish cemetery, Yahudiyalar Kabristan. That's what Jews called their cemetery, a Kabristan. So there was an extraordinary amount of crossover between Jewish and Muslim culture in these Radhanite hubs on the Silk Road. Here's another example, and one that brings India a bit closer. In Kyrgyzstan, in the city of Osh, where my grandmother, Lola Freud, you may remember from the first photo in her nice silk dress, she spent much of the war in the Fergana Valley and in Osh, amongst other places. Now, in the city of Osh, which is the biggest city in Kyrgyzstan in the Fergana Valley, there is a large hill called the Takht-e Suleiman, which means in Tajik, the throne of Solomon. Now, how the heck did it get its name? The Takht-e Suleiman. It was considered a holy site by local people there. And there is evidence that it had been considered a holy site for a long, long time. Some people have suggested that it was named for the Mongol Solmon. It means in Mongolian, Venus, the star. But everywhere in this area, we find the name Suleiman. And local legend has it that Suleiman, the king of the Israelites, had journeyed east into the Fergana Valley. He'd come with jinns on a flying carpet, and he'd alighted at the top of this hill in Osh. And a temple had been built there in honor of Suleiman. The same story, by the way, is told in Kashmir. There's a Takht-e Suleiman just north of Srinagar. And the same story is told there about Solomon having come to Kashmir. In the 18th century, one of the Persian names for Kashmir was the Bagh-e-Suleiman, the Garden of Suleiman. In Pakistan, there's a mountain range called the Suleimans. And Solomon's name appears everywhere, which suggests some kind of mobility of, if not Israelites, then of stories about Jews, stories about Israelites through this area. Now, in about 1495, a young Chagtai chieftain went to the Takht-e Suleiman in Osh. He was feeling sick and tired. He had been the Prince of Samarkand, but he'd been driven out of there 3 times. And he went up to the top of the Takht-e Suleiman for inspiration. He prayed to Solomon for guidance. And apparently in a vision, Solomon said to him, "Go to India." And he did. Later, this Chagtai chieftain would be known as Babur, the first Mughal emperor. And he built on the Takht-e Suleiman a hajra, a retreat, now known as the Hajra-e-Babur. It still survives there. It's a beautiful, typical Mughal structure. Now, Babur brought with him a deep reverence for Suleiman as one of his spiritual guides. And this got passed on to his Mughal descendants. Now, if you look at that map on the right, you'll see if you travel south from Bukhara, you'll pass through Termez, Kabul, Peshawar, all Mughal territories, to Lahore. Let's go to Lahore. In the Kala Burj of the Lahore Fort, I saw the ceiling and I was blown away by it because it involves paintings that look nothing like your typical Mughal miniatures. Mughal miniatures usually involve people depicted from the side. By contrast, and it's hard to see in this image, you have faces that are front on, that look remarkably like Western Renaissance paintings. I asked my friend Nadra, who accompanied me to the fort, "What are these paintings?" She said Jahangir had them painted. And these are pictures of Solomon's retinue. King Solomon the Wise was regarded by Jahangir as the model for a king. So like his great-grandfather Babur, Jahangir believed that Solomon was the inspiration for good rule in the territory of Hindustan. Here we see Solomon's attendants, his retinue, fighting dragons and demons. But the legacy of Solomon, the Israelite king, for the Mughals was even stronger than this. This is Humayuns Tomb in Delhi. And everywhere over the tomb, people who visited the tomb will recognize this. You'll see this particular symbol. It looks remarkably like the Jewish Magen David, the Star of David, the symbol that is on the flag of Israel now, and that we associate with Judaism all around the world. At the time Humayun built his tomb, though, this was not associated with Jews per se. The symbol was known as the Khatam Suleiman, the seal of Solomon. And it was a mystical symbol. that was supposed to date back to the time of Egypt. It was used by alchemists and early Arabic mystics as a symbol to ward off jinns and evil. It was meant to represent impenetrability. In other words, the incorruptibility of the soul, of morality of spirit. Now, to that extent, the Khatam Suleiman has been singularized as a Muslim symbol. But in fact, because of the dialogues all along the Silk Road, the Khatam Suleiman wasn't thought of as simply Islamic. It was valued also by Jews, by Jewish traders. We find in many Jewish burial sites along the Silk Road the Khatam Suleiman. It was not yet known as the Star of David. That was something that happened in Europe only in the 15th and 16th century. And then it was intensified in the 19th century when the founder of Zionism, which is another story altogether, Theodor Herzl, appropriated it as the symbol of Judaism and Jewish nationalism. But at this point, the Khatam Suleiman was a symbol of conversation between Jews and Muslims and other cultures along the Silk Road. And those other cultures included what we would now identify, even though they didn't call themselves that at this time, Hindus. The Shatkona is, of course, identical morphologically to the Khatam Suleiman. It's a Hindu symbol that represents the unity of the earth principle and the sky principle coming together, Parvati and Shiva coming together. The architects of Humayuns Tomb were probably aware of the meaning of the Shatkona, because after all, many of their subjects were Hindus. So this symbol was a wonderful way to communicate a syncretic ideal, that this place is sacred to Muslims, to Hindus, but it's a place that Jews would have also recognized the symbol as being meaningful, of some kind of spiritual integrity. So what we're talking about here with the Khatam Suleiman come Shatkona is not just Judeo-Muslim syncretism, but Judeo-Muslim Hindu syncretism. And as strange as that may sound, it was quite pervasive in the Hindustan of the medieval period. And I want to dwell on it because this is one of the most delicious, forgotten parts of our history in the subcontinent. Now, I'm going to travel to Ayodhya, not because of the recent UP election results, but because the history of Ayodhya is much more interesting than certain people who have political power now allow it to be. We're traveling to Ayodhya at a time when it was also known as Awadh, and at a time when Solomon also had a presence there. Now, one of the great Sanskrit texts of the medieval period is this work, the Suleiman Charitra, which is written by one of the truly brilliant poets of Sanskrit, Kalyana Malla, who also wrote the I'm blanking on the name, the Ananga Rasa, a sex treatise, an erotic treatise. And he wrote it in the erotic rasa. He was based in Ayodhya in 1500, and he was commissioned by the Muslim ruler of Ayodhya to write a story about Solomon, King Solomon, the Israelite. So this is a tale in Sanskrit written for a Muslim prince named Lad Khan about two Jewish men, Solomon and Solomon's father, David. In the Suleiman Charitra, David and Solomon are called Dawood and Suleiman, which are the Arabic names for David and Solomon. David's wife, Bathsheba, is also a character in the Suleiman Charitra. Bathsheba is the mother of Suleiman. Suleiman, interestingly, is an expert in yoga. He knows all the forms of yoga, we are told. Bathsheba has been renamed Saptasutta, which is Sanskrit for daughter 7. Now that is a direct translation of the Hebrew meaning of Bathsheba, which means daughter 7 in Hebrew. So Kalyana Malla either knew Hebrew or he knew people who knew Hebrew. It's a reminder that the Ayodhya Avad of 1500 was an extraordinarily cosmopolitan hub on the Jewish Silk Road, through which Jewish merchants would pass, telling stories of Solomon, stories that had also been told in Kashmir, in what is now Kyrgyzstan, what is now Pakistan. These stories were also told in what is now Uttar Pradesh, and told not just to Jews, but to Hindus and Muslims who were capable of appreciating each other's traditions and making them part of their own dynamic conversations. Here's another example of Judeo-Muslim Hindu syncretism. That rather, as they say in Punjabi, healthy man squatting in the middle is a mystic named Sayyid Sarmad Kashani. As his name indicates, he originally came from Kashan, a merchant trading town in Persia. He was born a Jew. He was trained as a rabbi, but he was also, in terms of his day job, a merchant who spent a lot of time in Sindh. In Sindh, he went to a mushaira one night where he heard a young boy named Abhay Chand, a Hindu, singing a ghazal. And Sayyid Sarmad Kashani, the rabbi merchant, fell in love. The two became a couple. And Sayyid Sarmad, who was fascinated by spirituality, assumed the guise of a kalandar, a wandering Sufi. But he was also deeply immersed in tantric law. And Sayyid Sarmad said, I am a Jew, I am a Muslim, I'm a tantric. Abhay Chand, his Hindu lover, was taught Persian and Hebrew and produced the very first Persian translation of the book of Genesis, written in the Indian subcontinent. So Sayyid Sarmad Kashani called himself a follower of the Furqan, a priest, a monk, a Jewish rabbi, an infidel, and a Muslim. This Kalandar yogi rabbi is typical of the Judeo-Muslim Hindu syncretism that was a feature of the Jewish Silk Road, which was also a Muslim and Hindu Silk Road in northern Hindustan at this time. And Abhay Chand is also typical of this Jewish Silk Road. He is described as having written a couplet that goes, I follow the Quran as much as I follow Torah and Talmud, but I'm neither a Jew, nor a Christian, nor a Muslim. A wonderful inversion of Sayyid Sarmad saying, I'm all these things. I'm all, but I'm none of these things, precisely because I'm all these things. Now, the person on the right in this amazing image is Dara Shikoh, the son of the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, and also author of the brilliant comparative religious treatise, the Majma ul Bahrain, meaning the confluence of the seas. This is often understood as the confluence of two seas, of Hinduism and Islam. But as you can tell from this picture, Dara Shikoh was very interested in conversation across all sorts of religious borders. And he summoned Sayyid Sarmad Kashani to Delhi to be one of his spiritual advisors. It's very interesting that Dara Shikoh named his first son, who would have been at that time, if not the presumptive heir to the Mughal Empire, because things were never clear in terms of lineal succession. But he was at least, directly in line for the throne. Dara Shikoh's son, Suleiman. Suleiman, the name that meant so much to Jews and Muslims and Hindus in Kashmir, in Ayodhya, Awadh, and now in Delhi. Now, here's another example of Judeo-Muslim Hindu syncretism. In the mid-17th century, an amazing book was published at much the same time as the Majma'-ul-Bahrain, called the Dabistan-e-Mahazib. It's one of the first treatises of comparative religion, which looks at all the religions of the subcontinent. Interestingly, it separates Brahmanism from various other types of belief that we would now associate with Hinduism. But it also looks at Parsi religion, various sects of Islam, Judaism. Now, in the Dabistan-e-Mahazib, we have a very intriguing account of how Jews advised Akbar in Fatehpur Sikri during the conversations between religion that led to Akbar founding a new pluralistic religion called Dini Hilahi. But there's also an account of two Jewish men who settled in Patna. They were merchants, and they're described in the Dabistan as having Arabic names, what we would think of as Muslim names, Harun and Musa. They live in Patna next to the Ganga. And why do these merchants base themselves in Patna? Because they're bhakts. They're committed Jews. The Dabistan praises them for their impeccable integrity because of their Jewish beliefs. But they're bhakts of a guru who is also a Maulana. Maulana Farhana Bharam, a mystic who combines elements of Sufism and Tantric thought. So these Jews were followers of a man who was a Zoroastrian, born a Zoroastrian, who styled himself as a guru and a Maulana. Whether I'd speak about the best known Jewish community in Israel, the Bnei Israel, who lived on the Konkan coast. They are part of the story, but a rather unusual part of the story. If you go to Navgaon, south of Bombay on the Konkan coast, you'll find the oldest Jewish cemetery in the subcontinent. The claim is that it's 2,000 years old. That's when the Bnei Israel's ancestors are first thought to have made landfall. We don't know exactly when the Bnei Israel ancestors came. It's highly likely that it was even more than 2,000 years ago, because the Bnei Israel don't celebrate certain Jewish rituals that have become standard since about 200 BCE. But the question of their exact historical origin, I think we can put aside because we don't really know the answer. What's interesting is how they are a story of Judeo-Muslim Hindu syncretism. Now, the Bnei Israel are a Jewish people who observe many Muslim traditions. For the longest time, they called their places of worship not synagogues, but masjids. Their religious leaders weren't rabbis, but qazis. But they were also absorbed into the Hindu caste system as oil presses, which is why for years they were known as the Shanivar, the Saturday, telis, working with oil. Further south, we get more Judeo-Muslim Hindu syncretism. In Kerala, which was a major hub of the maritime Silk Road. One of the best known drinks in Kerala is very intriguingly called Suleimani chai. And it's become a symbol in certain parts of Kerala of cross-cultural harmony. There was a project recently, I think started in about 2015, to provide Suleimani chai to anyone poor, regardless of their religious cultural background. It was supposed to be meaningful to Jew, Muslim, Hindu, Christian alike. And this is tapping into a sort of Solomonic inheritance in Kerala that is not unlike what we find in North India. And it's quite possible that stories of Solomon again had come not overland through the Silk Road routes, but over the sea on Arab dhows with Muslim but also Jewish merchants who came to the Malabar ports trading. Now, let's consider the Chembita Pali Mosque in Kochi. This is an amazing building which was built in about 1300. You wouldn't guess looking at it from the outside that it's a mosque. It looks more like what is called in Malayalam an ambalam, a Hindu temple. And indeed, the mosque was built at the orders of a Hindu Raja who gave a grant to the Muslim community to build a temple. What's interesting is that the timber was provided by a Jewish merchant named Shenjurde, who was, by the way, a devotee of a Sufi mystic named al-Bukhari, a Jew who was a Sufi who was working with a Hindu Raja to produce a mosque, only in Kerala. Here's something a bit more recent. There's a shrine in a neighborhood of Kochi called Chakamodam to a saint named Namia Mota. And this shrine is considered holy by Hindus, by Muslims, by Christians, even though it's a Jewish shrine. Namia Mota was a Jewish mystic based in Kochi, who had many of the powers of Suleiman in Jewish and Muslim legend. He was supposed to be able to fly in the air, to fight jinns, etc. He was also a champion of the poor, which is one of the reasons why he is revered. But here's yet another example of the Suleimani chai syncretism of Kerala. Now, what's happened to this culture in India? We can more or less draw a line through it. We're living in an age where identities have become increasingly cut off from each other and weaponized in response to each other. Cultures that were often not just neighbors, but in dynamic conversation with each other, increasingly are encouraged to regard each other as timeless adversaries. But there's still pockets of Judeo-Muslim Hindu syncretism, pockets of the old Jewish Silk Road in India. Here's one. This is a shrine in a darga just by the Meena Bazaar in Old Delhi. It's the shrine for Sayyid Sarmad Kashani, Dara Shikoh's old advisor. It's interesting that the shrine is claimed diversely by Muslims, by followers of a Hindu sect, and by Jews like me. It's one of the few places in Delhi I'll happily go to worship, not as a Jew, but as a committed pluralist. And then there's one more example. Solomon is still alive and well. Where? In Mumbai. The last Solomon. You can see his name there, Solomon F. Sofer, the managing trustee of the Knesset Eliyahu synagogue. His job is to certify that products are kashrut, which means kosher, according to Jewish law. But this is a certificate for a very interesting commodity, psyllium. Psyllium is now a panacea for people who suffer from gastro problems, from upset stomachs. may seem like the ultimate in sort of new age medicine. My tummy is upset, I'll pop some psyllium. But in fact, psyllium has a long Silk Road history in India. The last Solomon, the Jew who signs off on the kosher quality of psyllium, would surely know that psyllium is called in India isabgol, a term that comes from the Sanskrit asva and gol, horseflower. But psyllium is also called in India aspagol, which comes from the Persian asp and gul, which also mean horse and flower. Jew is dispensing Sanskrit and Persian remedy. Isabgol, aspagol, was the most popular piece of medicine taken by Sartavaha traders, the Radhanites, as they moved across the Silk Road. It was the equivalent of Imodium now, the all-purpose traveler's remedy to make sure that your stomach remained settled as you moved from site to site. I love that in the certificate, we have an echo of the history of the Silk Road, the syncretic Silk Road that brought together some of the most vital traditions of the subcontinent, Jewish, Muslim, and Hindu. It's a tragedy in this age that two of those identities are no longer included in the list of those who qualify for refugee status in this country because they're thought to have their proper homes elsewhere. I'll stop right there and I'll be happy to host any questions you might have.
What a talk. You so deftly wove everything together, Jonathan. History, culture, and you brought us all up to date with Mr. Solomon's certificate, so to speak. Yes, there are lots of learnings, and I think your second last slide was very powerful, where you struck a line across Judeo-Islamic Hindu syncretism. Sad that we are not honoring what the world has learned from different parts over the years. Lots of compliments have come in about the talk, about how thorough, how methodical, etc. it was. Yes, Shehnaz, his book has just come out. You should get or about to come out?
It's not out yet.
Okay.
I'm hoping that it will be out sometime early next year.
Okay.
It is written. I'm in the process of doing some fairly substantial revisions because of new information that has come to light. Because no one has really written about this, and there's a treasure trove of, as I've recently discovered, unknown information. So I'm incorporating that into the new material.
So let me read out some of the things which people have said. Dizzying and dazzling, brilliant, amazing, and so on and on and on. Let me go to the questions, Jonathan. One of the questions was, you answered that Jesus spoke Aramaic, but there was a question whether the Jewish Aramaic speakers were of Ethiopian descent.
No, is the short answer. The Jewish Aramaic speakers were of Jewish descent, but their ancestors had been part of the Achaemenid Empire. Aramaic was, as I mentioned at the beginning, it was a Babylonian language that became the Persian lingua franca. So we may think of Aramaic as a Jewish language now, but it was in fact a language of the earliest version of the Silk Road. It was a language of trade and administration, and it was an Indian language. You know, Ashoka is putting it on his pillars in Taxila and Lagman. It's also part of the inscriptions of grants in Kerala. So it's just a sign of how much the Persian Jewish legacy has had effects, ripple effects, that we have forgotten the history of now, when we say it's just a Jewish language.
You mentioned Kerala, Jonathan, and you mentioned the Suleimani chai. Somebody made a comment that Persian tea is also called Suleimani chai. I wanted to ask you about another connection with Kerala and this trade. Those were the kolam copper plates.
Yes.
Can you throw some light on the kolam copper plates which are held in a church in Kerala, and
Yes.
which have inscriptions by people of Persian descent, of Middle Eastern descent?
Yes. So Syrian Christians trace their origin to, or some Syrian Christians, to a man named Thomas of Cana, who is supposed to have arrived in the Malabar coast in about the 3rd or 4th century. Now, Thomas of Cana wouldn't have identified as Christian. He was a believer in Christ. He's closer to what we'd call now a Jew for Jesus. He was of Jewish extraction, a Persian Jew, speaking Aramaic and Persian. And his followers came with him and found land, were granted land, an area right next to Cranganore, which was the Jewish settlement near Muziris in Kerala. Now, it's clear that these early Christians felt a deep affinity with the Jews who they were settled right next to. They spoke a common language. Interestingly, they sang identical kolas, which is Malayalam for prayer song. And this is something that quite a bit of research has been done on, but a lot of the early Syrian Christian traditions are basically Jewish traditions. There'd be a chuppah at a wedding, a glass smashed underfoot, etc. Now, these copper plates are of really ancient provenance. I can't give you a precise date, but they're inscribed. There are in fact several sets of these plates. There's one set that has gone missing, but they were discovered by Portuguese visitors and taken by the Portuguese back to Portugal in the 16th century. And these granted a Jewish merchant named Joseph Rabban the status of a Raja. So he became known as the Jewish king in the Malabar. As far as we can tell, he was basically given the status of a zamindar and the right to travel on elephants and so on. But he's a beloved memory amongst the Cochin Jews.
Yes.
So that's one set of plates that's gone missing, but a grant to the Syrian Christian community still survives and is displayed in a Syrian Christian church. And it's, again, a testament to syncretism, because the inscriptions are in Arabic and Malayalam, Old Malayalam, and in Syriac Aramaic, which continues to be the liturgical language of much Syrian Christianity. The Portuguese came and tried to spoil everything, saying, "Oh, you're speaking a sinful language, you should speak Latin," which is why a lot of Christians in Kerala were Catholicized. But there's still very strong pockets of this Aramaic culture that can be traced back to these Persian Jews who are followers of Christ.
True. There was a question about, there was a request actually. Could you share your broad views on the importance of the major Silk Route cities such as Bukhara, Samarkand in the invasions into India starting the 10th century?
Yeah. I mean, that's a difficult question to answer because it almost suggests that these cities are responsible for the invasions. I don't think cities or places are responsible for invasions, people are. But it wasn't from Bukhara. The Ghaznavids were coming from, they were part of Turkic confederations who were not city-based. The interesting thing about a lot of the early so-called invasions was that they were movements by militarized pastoralists who didn't live in the cities, but who had strong trading relations with the former Sogdian Satavahas and the Radhanites who were based in the hubs. So Bukhara, for instance, it was right, I mean, you had this incredibly delicate ecosystem of steppes and oasis, where the Turks would move their sheep and their yurts around the oasis, the steppes, but they would come to the oasis to sell wool, which the Jews would dye, and the Tajik artisans would weave into carpets. So these are stories of multicultural confluence. After a while, some of these Turkic confederations, warlords emerged from them who sought to expand their base. But they weren't necessarily barbarians or savages who came with swords. They were often very sort of shrewd entrepreneurs who were looking to forge new trade connections. And I think this is something that is often forgotten in the popular narration of the coming of Islam to the subcontinent. In fact, the first Muslims who came to the subcontinent were coming to Kerala in the 8th and 9th centuries. One of them was named Suleiman. And another was named Vavur, who is arguably connected to the figure who is worshipped in Ayyappan temples, who has a small shrine of his own. Oh. So I mean, we have cultures of conversation rather than of the kind of conflict that is presumed by invasion. Were the Muslims coming from the north soldiers? Yes, they were. But we're not talking about Vladimir Putin rolling in the tanks into Ukraine.
There was a question about the isolated pockets of Judaism present in India, for example, in the Northeast. Were these people who now were found lately in the Northeast also part of the Silk Route migrations? How would they have connected with the Bene Israels and the other waves of Judaism coming into India?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because the simple answer is we don't know, but we can speculate. So the B'nai Menashe are an interesting group of Jews from Manipur and Mizoram. Their immediate ancestors had converted to Christianity, but they'd always been, shall we say, more interested in the Old Testament than the New. And they claimed that certain aspects of the Old Testament resonated with their old ancient stories. The B'nai Menashe, which means the sons of Manasseh, converted to Judaism really only in the 1970s, starting in the 70s. But they claim to have been historically Jewish, the descendants of Manasseh, who was one of the who gave his name to one of the lost tribes. He was the son of Jacob. Now, it's very interesting that there is someone called Manmassi in the law of the Chinkuki in Mizoram and Manipur. And Manmassi is supposed to have delivered his people across a sea, a Red Sea. This is pointed to as a cultural memory of the tale of the Israelites being liberated from Egypt. In Kyrgyzstan, there is a character named Manas, and Manmassi is pronounced in a lot of the dialects of the Northeast as Manasi. Mm-hmm. So there may be a connection between this figure Manas in Kyrgyzstan and Manmassi in the Northeast. So the Manas of Kyrgyzstan is the son of someone named, in legends, the Manas Dastani, is the son of Yaqub. Uh-huh. Right? And this Manas, Yaqub's story is identical to the story of Jacob in the Hebrew Bible. So some Kyrgyz claim descent from the lost tribes. So there's a suggestion that the lost tribes may have migrated east along the routes of the Achaemenid Empire, settled in the Fergana Valley, moved from there into Tibet and China, and then came
down into India.
Into Northeast India. But there's another connection that's intriguing. There's a group in Andhra Pradesh who call themselves the Bene Ephraim.
Yes.
They're a former Dalit group who again say that certain memories and legends jive with those of the B'nai Menashe, and they think that there might be some connection. Ephraim was Manasseh's brother, so they've posited that there's some connection possibly with the B'nai Menashe. Now, we can't know for sure, but certainly the B'nai Ephraim believe it. So
just goes to show we are all brothers under the skin.
Exactly.
We have a foodie in our midst. Ishanika wants to know briefly whether you uncovered any culinary delights in your work of these cross-cultural connections.
I wish I could say I had. One of the most interesting things I found that relates to food, actually, is bread. So there was a very interesting Jewish figure in Balkh, Afghanistan, a city on the Silk Road, which gave its name to what is now called the Bactrian Empire. And this man was known as Chiwi. He was a Jewish heretic living in about the 8th century, around the time of the coming of Islam. And he wrote in Aramaic and Hebrew. And he said that manna from heaven wasn't really a miracle. It's just like the flatbread that you can buy in the local bazaar. And what's his name for this flatbread? Naan, which is the Persian word for bread, but which is also the North Indian word for bread. It's a reminder, again, that we're all connected.
Sashi Varma has a question. Can any links be drawn between the expulsion of Jews from Jerusalem and the syncretism that you talked about between Zoroastrianism and Judaism in India?
Yeah. So it depends which expulsion we're talking about, because Jews have been expelled several times from Jerusalem. But I think you're alluding to the initial expulsion by Nebuchadnezzar in 589 BCE. So at that point, the Jews were not yet Jews. They were Israelites. They were monotheists, but so much of what we associate formally with Judaism did not yet exist. It was only in Babylon during the captivity, when Jews had Zoroastrian neighbours, that they encountered crucial concepts that would become a central part of Judaism, like messianism. The idea of a Messiah was not part of Israelite religion. They found it in Zoroastrian law. The idea of angels was not part of Israelite belief. It came into Judaism, or what was formalized as Judaism, through conversations with Zoroastrianism. Certain Jewish practices, I was just talking about this with Farouk before the start of this talk, like burying fingernails. If you cut your fingernails, an Orthodox Jew says you have to bury it. That came from Zoroastrianism too. So yes, there was a profound link. And I've sort of become aware of the link. I mean, it's interesting that visitors, European visitors to the west coast of India in the 17th century, often mistook the local Parsi communities for Jews. And it's not surprising. I went to a Parsi funeral recently. It's the only Parsi funeral I've been to. And I was astonished because so many of the aspects of the ritual were, for me, Jewish rituals. The swaying while praying, the wearing of pure clothes that tied, I forget what the name of that item that ties one bereaver to another.
The handkerchief.
Yes, all this resonated. And it's yet another reminder that religions aren't born fully formed. They come out of conversations. And that if you go back far enough, we'll find that no religion is absolutely pure and singular.
Sashi wanted to know whether it is likely that there were Persians involved with the trade with the subcontinent even before the Achaemenids.
Most likely, yes, although the earliest Persians were basically nomad pastoralists who wanted to be Babylonians. The Babylonians were considered the apex of civilization because they had a city, they were settled, they had a script and culture. And the Persians were fairly backward and considered themselves backward. It was only after they took over Babylon that I mean, they reinvented themselves as Babylonians, basically. That's why they took on the Aramaic language. And it was probably the Babylonians who were trading with South India in particular, and Middle Easterns. There's every suggestion that King Solomon was already trading with South India. The Hebrew biblical word for peacock, tagai, is very close to the Tamil word for peacock.
I see.
Which suggests that, you know, these words traveled, just like, you know, Kalat and Galat traveled from Persia to Romania.
Reminds me of that poem, Quincurrent of Nineveh and distant Ophir, sailing home to haven in sunny Palestine.
Yes.
Right. I think let's move on to the next and possibly the last question. Nikhil wants to know, you've used the term Turks. So he feels that Turkic is a very modern invention. Who were these Turks that you refer to? Were they pastoralists from Transoxania or from Turkmenistan?
Well, it's complicated. The word Turk, in fact, begins to appear in about the 5th century, Turuk. And it's a Mongolian word that is associated with royal lineage or celestial lineage. And there are many cultures that sort of become associated with Turuk from that time on. When I'm talking about Turkic cultures, I'm not saying Turkish. I'm talking about Turkic cultures. I'm not talking about modern Turkey or the Ottomans, who were just one of the many Turkic confederations that developed, flourished, sometimes ebbed, all over Eurasia, basically. But I'm talking about Chagatai Turks, for instance. Babur, even though he's called a Mughal, he was Mongolian on his mother's side, but he considered himself Turkic. His patrilineal lineage was to Tamburlain, or Timur, and he spoke his tongue was Chagatai, a Turkic tongue. So Turkic is a very broad term. It also becomes slippery at the margins because there was a lot of fusion between Persian and Turkish. So Uzbek, for instance, is a Turkic language. But in Uzbek, which was a language my mother actually grew up speaking, this is why there's such a deep personal connection for me to the Jewish Silk Road. I discovered only after I'd moved to India and learned Hindi that we suddenly had linguistic points in common. Something difficult for her was mushkil. That's Uzbek for difficult. Something easy was oson. Asan. She called bread. She said, I survived during the war on non. That was the Uzbek word for bread, non. So we're talking about cultures that were constantly blending. And so this is why I'm saying that we have been conditioned to think of cultures and religions as singular traditions. They're not. They're not silos. They are like the Silk Route itself, always a network of connections in which we see all sorts of exchanges of commodities, of culture, but also even of genes.
I'd like to end with a comment in a lighter vein. Angana Moitra says she noticed that the Silk Route passes through Kiev and she wants you to give this talk to Putin.
I don't think I'd last much longer if I did, but yeah.
So thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you everybody for attending, and do keep on attending our Saturday talks. Thank you.
Thank you.